What I'm going to be talking about tonight is electric vehicles and charging. And I'm going to be starting from a very introductory level. So this assumes that there's no knowledge, no high level of knowledge that the audience already has. So apologies in advance for those of you that are EV enthusiasts. There might be some new information, but this is really targeted at those that are interested, but perhaps haven't spent a whole lot of time researching it and are just keen to learn a little bit more in order to assist them in perhaps their next vehicle purchase and to give them the information that you need to be able to make a good decision. So I might start off with this historical picture from 1906. This is actually an electric car. And at that time, it was still a pretty even bet as to whether petrol, diesel, or electric would win the race as automobiles became a more common thing in our cities and towns. At this time, because of the fairly poor battery technology and also the less developed electricity network, it meant that petrol and diesel vehicles won that first battle, and they became, as everybody knows, the dominant form of drivetrain for motor vehicles. But that is now beginning to change because of the increase or the improvements rather in battery technology. And that means that you can now drive a lot further than you could back in 1906. And there are a lot more places to be able to charge up as well. So as I'll talk about soon, a lot of countries are now seeing the majority of, or at least a few countries are seeing the majority of their new vehicles sold being EV, and it's increasing a lot in Australia as well. So the overview for tonight is I'm going to talk about why it's important to transition to low emissions transport. I'll also provide an introduction to EVs and also talk about how much electric vehicles cost and how far you can get on a charge as well. And it's important to highlight there that whilst most of the EVs that are purchased are new vehicles, because EVs are still a very new part of the market, there's also an increasing range of secondhand EVs that are entering the market. That means that you can get an EV for a lot less than what you could have a few years ago. And that will continue to happen, especially as large corporate fleets that have EVs, those EVs start to get 3, 4, 5 years old. Fleet managers usually put them onto the secondhand market, which means that ordinary people can go out and buy one at a price that's a lot more affordable than buying a brand new one. And also talk about charging. So range anxiety is one of the things that can hold people back from buying an EV. And I'll talk a little bit about charging and the opportunities for charging and how you can plan an EV trip to ensure that you've still got enough electricity in the battery to get to where you need to go. I also talk about things like whether you can tow an EV. And I know that utes and towing are really important for people that live in the Yarra Ranges in particular. And those sorts of considerations are going to be crucial for a lot of people when they're making decisions about their next vehicle purchase. So I said right at the beginning that I will talk a little bit about emissions reduction, and this graph I think is really important because what it shows is the trend in emissions over time for the last 50 years or so. And what it shows is that our emissions have been increasing. And whilst there was a small dip in 2020 because of COVID-19, that trend has now started to tick up again, and we're actually driving just as much, if not a little bit more than we were before COVID-19. And you also see these two red lines. So many of you will be familiar with the Commonwealth Government's target of a 43% reduction in emissions by 2030. That bottom red line shows you what that would look like from our emissions profile. And as you can see, our emissions are trending higher, even though they would need to drop considerably in order to reach that target. So there's still a lot of work to do. And unlike, say, the electricity grid, with transport emissions, it's made up of lots of small decisions that households and businesses right around the country make around their vehicle choices. And it shows that we're going to need to change the way that we transport ourselves if we've got any chance of getting close to meeting that 43% reduction target that the federal government has outlined. I think it's really also very important to highlight that there are really 4 different pathways through which we can reduce emissions. And when we say we, I'm talking about government, business, and households together. I think it's unfair to lump the responsibility to households and individuals alone. This is something that's a shared responsibility, led initially by government, but also business, and then finally households as well, where they've got the capacity to make changes. These are the 4 different pathways through which transport emissions can be reduced. So the first one is really the subject of what we're going to be talking about this evening, which is fuel efficiency improvement. So moving from an internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle is an example of fuel efficiency improvement. And then the other pathways are mode change. So if you were to leave your car at home and walk to a train station, or ride your bike to work or to see a friend, that would be an example of mode change. And you could also decrease vehicle kilometres travelled. That's what VKT stands for. It's just transport planning speak for vehicle kilometres travelled. And you can do that by, let's say, if you're visiting a set of local shops, instead of going to a big box outlet on the outskirts of a township, you're reducing your trip distance, and therefore you're reducing your emissions, even if you're still using the same motor vehicle. And then finally, you can do what a lot of you are doing right now, which is avoiding trips. So 4 or 5 years ago, we might have done a session like this at a town hall or a council office. These days, it can be done as a webinar, and that's an example of a trip avoided. So instead of driving to the council office to hear this presentation, most of you will be in the comfort of your own home, and you haven't caused any emissions through the travel that you would have needed to do if you were going to a venue. So, and also a lot of us tend to work from home at least part of the week, and that's another example of trips avoided. So these are the 4 pathways, and I'll be talking most about fuel efficiency tonight. But just as another introductory slide, this was prepared by us for the City of Melbourne, and what it shows is a variety of different modes of transport, and we've got black balloons that represent the grams of carbon dioxide per person kilometre travelled. So the bigger the balloon, the more pollution. And at the bottom, you've got these footprints, and those footprints represent the space consumption per metre squared per occupant. And what I think is important to highlight in this is that an electric vehicle, if it's charged with ordinary grid electricity, is cleaner than a standard Victorian motor vehicle powered by petrol or diesel, but not by that much. It's really when you start to charge those vehicles with renewable energy that you start to get the big improvements from a carbon perspective. It's also important to recognise that some carbon-free or carbon-light forms of transport include public transport. With the trams, I know that there are no trams in Yarra Ranges, so I won't talk a lot about that, but they have offset all their emissions by purchasing solar power. But even a train, even when it's run by standard Victorian grid electricity, it still has a much smaller carbon footprint than motor vehicles. The other thing I wanted to highlight is things like e-bikes and standard bikes and walking, that they are some of the cleanest forms of transport. And I won't be talking about them a lot tonight, but I think it's important to recognise that this is a multi-pronged solution that requires a diversity of different transport options in order to both meet our mobility needs, but also try and reduce our emissions. The other reason why I'm showing this slide is because it shows that the footprints at the bottom there for an electric car, the footprint is still exactly the same, the space footprint, as a petrol or diesel powered car. So the point here is that electric cars don't eliminate all of the problems with the transport system. They have the capacity, though, to eliminate tailpipe emissions or exhaust pipe emissions compared to petrol or diesel vehicles. And if we convert, and this is a typical road on a busy city street, with internal combustion engine cars. And if we're able to wave a magic wand and convert them all to electric cars overnight, then it would look like this. So basically the same. So that just highlights the importance of, yes, electric cars are really important and crucial to meeting our carbon reduction targets, but they're not everything. And we also need to look for opportunities to reduce the need to use motor vehicles so that we don't have to get into our car every time we leave our home to do the things that we need to do every day. So it's all about doing more with less emissions and less space consumption as well where possible. But I also recognise that in certain parts of the Yarra Ranges, it's there isn't a very good transport system in some parts of Yarra Ranges, and the bicycle infrastructure network isn't complete, and some trips are too far to walk or to cycle. So recognise that, and there'll be certainly people, I'm sure, that are here tonight that can think about journeys that simply have to be done by car. All right, so in terms of the types of EVs and types of vehicles, I just want to quickly identify the definition so that we're all clear on what an EV is and some of the differences between an EV and an internal combustion engine. So at the top of this slide here is a conventional car, so a petrol or diesel powered vehicle, which represents about 99% of all vehicles on our roads in Yarra Ranges. Then you've got a hybrid vehicle. So that's like a Toyota Prius that has a petrol tank, but when you brake, it stores electricity in a small battery, relatively small battery, that can power the vehicle for short distances. Then you've got a plug-in hybrid, which is exactly the same as a normal hybrid, except instead of just generating the electricity through braking, you can also plug that vehicle into a power point, and you can charge that battery at home or at work, and then travel for about 50 kilometers or so using the electricity alone with a small electric motor that's in the car. But then you can rely on petrol or diesel once the energy in that battery has been expended, and you can then travel as you would in a normal petrol or diesel car. But that requires a lot of, the user needs to be fairly engaged about how they're maximising the use of the electricity in order to maximise the emissions reduction. A lot of plug-in hybrids that are used in fleets don't tend to get the fuel efficiency benefits that they could, because the user isn't suitably motivated to make sure that it's always charged because they've got that petrol or diesel backup. And then finally, the bottom one is the all-electric, the battery electric vehicle. That's what I'm going to be talking about mostly tonight. So that's where there's no petrol tank, there's no diesel, you never have to visit a petrol station. You only get energy by plugging it into either a wall at home or to a public charger, a faster charger that can charge up your vehicle in as little as 18 minutes, depending upon the sort of vehicle that you've got and the size of the battery. So one of the most common questions we get asked is, well, how much do they cost and how far do they go? So you can buy a second-hand EV for around $20,000. That's the entry level. That will get you about 120 kilometres in a full charge. And then you can also buy a new electric car. They start at around $38,000 or $39,000, and that will get you around 350 to 450 kilometers in a charge, and then you can spend, ridiculous amounts of money on other ones that can do all sorts of things and can get you from 0 to 100 in 2.8 seconds and that sort of stuff. But I don't think that's really a solution for a lot of people, and they can go up to 650 kilometers in a charge. I think at this point it's really important to mention, though, that one of the things that tricks a lot of people with EVs for the first time is that, unlike petrol or diesel vehicles, you actually get the best mileage when you're traveling in an inner urban or metropolitan environment where you've got stop-start driving, and you get less mileage when you're traveling at 100 or 110 on a freeway. So that's quite different to petrol or diesel. And it's important to recognize that, because when you're planning a road trip, you need to factor that in. So for instance, with the vehicle that I've got, we can get 450 kilometers in a charge in the city, but if I'm driving in the country, I factor in about 380 kilometers in a charge, because you end up burning more electricity per kilometer traveled when you're driving really fast in an EV, at 100 kilometers an hour or so, which is quite the opposite compared to petrol or diesel. So I just want to quickly mention where we're at compared to other countries. So Australia, this is a little bit old now, but a couple of years ago, about 2% of all new vehicles sold were battery electric vehicles, compared to, at the time, Norway, which was the market leader, at 72%. That's now changed quite a bit. So in Australia, over March of 2023, about 8 or 9% of all new vehicles sold were battery electric. So the market has really changed a lot, and that's partly because of the introduction of much lower cost EVs compared to what was there in 2019, 2020. In Norway, they're now hitting about 86% of all new vehicles sold are electric, and a number of countries have actually identified that they're going to be banning petrol or diesel powered cars for new purchases by around 2030 or 2035. I think the ACT is the first Australian jurisdiction that said that I think it's by 2035, they will ban the sale of new petrol or diesel vehicles. So that's the market trends, that's what's happening. And we're now hitting almost 10% in Australia for new vehicle sales for the most recent month in which data was available. And this just shows the growth that we've seen since 2011 on new vehicles sold that are EV. So it's changing very rapidly. So compared to a few years ago, electric vehicles are becoming cheaper. The range is getting longer. So for most electric cars, around 400 kilometers per charge is what you can roughly expect if you're driving in a metropolitan area. There's also a wider variety of models. So we're seeing smaller EVs, we're seeing some larger EVs, and over the next 2 years or so, we'll start to see the introduction of people movers and other vans that can be used for deliveries, as well as people movers that can seat 7 people. They're already on the road in places like the Netherlands, which is where I was last week, and we saw lots of delivery vehicles, people movers that can carry 7 people, and vehicles with higher clearances. And we're also seeing a rapid increase in charging opportunities. So the state and federal government and at times local councils are putting in public charging facilities that are enabling people that are away from their home to be able to charge up fairly rapidly in order to continue their journey. And we're also seeing more government agencies have stronger targets for zero emission fleets. And a lot of councils and other businesses are saying that by 2030, they want to have a zero emission fleet. So the benefits of EVs, so you improve local air quality and you reduce tailpipe greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, it's important to remember that the emissions reduction potential is only as great as the renewable energy that's going into the grid. So that's really important as well. And a lot of the electric vehicle charging operators are committing to only buying renewable energy for the electricity that's used in their public chargers. So in most cases, when you charge up at a public charger, the electricity is being produced either through wind or solar. You also reduce noise pollution. So especially at low motor vehicle speeds, once you start getting vehicles traveling at above, say, 40 kilometers an hour, it's actually the tire noise on the asphalt that's the majority of the noise of the vehicle, and that doesn't go away obviously with an EV, but for slower driving and for that the beginning of the acceleration, that's significantly reduced in terms of noise pollution for EVs. And you also have substantially lower running costs. So it costs about a third to run an EV compared to an internal combustion engine. That's both in terms of the petrol, diesel being much more expensive than electricity per kilometre travelled, but also the servicing costs are much less too, because there's so fewer moving parts in an EV compared to an internal combustion engine. So the EV that I run only needs to be serviced every 30,000 kilometres, and very often all you need a new set of tyres and some brake pads and maybe some windscreen wiper replacements, but it's much less than what you'd expect with an internal combustion engine. One of the big consumer trends that I think is really important is that surveys in Australia have found that about 50% of people are considering an EV for their next vehicle purchase. And one of the things that's really important is for those that are looking for a ute or a vehicle with a really high clearance as an EV. They're not plentiful at the moment in Australia, but my suggestion is for somebody that has those sorts of requirements to just hold off, and rather than perhaps buying a new Hilux or Ford Ranger, holding off and waiting until those vehicle models become available would be my suggestion, if you can and if you're in the position to do so. I think it's really hard to work out to finding the right EV for your particular household or your particular purpose, and just wanted to alert people to a really important website, which I'm sure we can send you the link to at the end of this presentation. It's an EV database that doesn't have any sort of commercial relationships with any of the vehicle manufacturers, but you can filter your requirements. So in terms of things like, for these screenshots, I've used towing capacity. So I've looked only for EVs that are able to tow, and it tells you how many kilograms of towing capacity it has, and also the efficiency and the range that you can get out of those vehicles. So that's a really good site. One of the things that might be a little bit frustrating for people using that site is that not all the vehicles shown in your search would necessarily be available in Australia right now, but you'll be able to find the vehicle, and then from that vehicle, you'll be able to then search in Australia whether those vehicles are available now. And if they're not available now, there's probably an even chance that in a year's time from now, they'll become available in Australia. And that will certainly become more likely once Australia adopts a national emissions standard, because that will encourage vehicle manufacturers to bring a lot of their EVs that they sell overseas into the Australian market. And that includes a lot of the lower cost EVs that currently aren't in Australia. I want to talk a little bit about towing, because towing, even though many of us don't tow all the time, when we make vehicle purchase decisions, if we have to tow some of the time, it becomes an important consideration. So some of the things that are important to know is that because of the faster acceleration that you get with an EV, because of the instant torque, you can accelerate faster under load when you're carrying a caravan or a boat or a trailer. But you do get less range, and that's really important to note, because if you're going on a road trip with a caravan, you need to be able to factor in that you're going to get less range depending upon the size of your caravan and the weight of your caravan, compared to if you're just driving that EV and not towing anything. It's highly dependent as well on the size of what you're towing and how much wind resistance there's likely to be, because once you're on the open road and you're going 100 kilometers an hour, it's actually the wind resistance rather than the weight that is the strongest determinant of the degree to which you will reduce your range when towing. And I've included a link at the bottom of this slide, which talks a lot more about the physics of towing with an EV and what factors are important. Here are just some of the vehicles that are available in other markets that are expected to become available in Australia over the coming months or years. So the top two are from the same vehicle manufacturer, Rivian, and they specialise in four-wheel drive utes and people movers. So the vehicle on the left has obviously is a ute, similar to something like a Ford Ranger or a Toyota Hilux, which are two of the top selling vehicles in Australia. But interestingly, because they've got extra room, because they don't have to account for the internal combustion engine, they can do other things that most internal combustion engines can't do. So, for instance, this vehicle pictured on the top left-hand corner of the slide, behind the second row of seats, behind that passenger door, there's actually a holo there that you can order as an extra, a pull-out camp kitchen, which has two induction burners and a sink to enable you to go camping. So I know that a lot of people have talked about the idea that EVs will ruin the weekend and be a war on tradies. Well, in actual fact, as I think I'll show in future slides in this presentation, EVs can actually help you enjoy your weekend and be a bonus for tradies as well, because most of the EVs that are utes that will be coming to Australia over coming years will have a bank of around 10 240 volt power outlets that you can use either while you're camping, or if you're a builder or someone that needs power off site, you'll be able to plug in your power tools as well. And then the bottom right-hand picture is an example of a smaller EV, and we're starting to see, certainly in Europe, and it will be coming to, these will be coming to Australia in future years, smaller EVs designed to be a household second car, where you're making short trips. You don't need to have a range of 400 or 500 kilometres. You can get away with something that has a range much shorter, like 60 kilometres, which still enables a lot of people to do the things they need to do around town, but perhaps not necessarily useful for longer road trips with a family. In terms of the cost comparison for a medium passenger vehicle, what we've got here is a comparison where We've compared an entry-level electric vehicle, which is the BYD Atto 3, which retails for around $40,000. And we've compared that to Toyota Camry, both a hybrid one and then a non-hybrid Toyota Camry. And we've looked at how many kilometres you'd need to do per year in order for the EV to become more economical. And what it shows is that under current petrol prices, you still have to drive a fair bit, around 55,000 kilometres a year, which is quite a bit more than the average in order for the payback period to be attractive. But what's important here is to recognise that the more you travel, the faster the payback period will be, and that will especially be the case if petrol prices were to increase. And the cheaper electric vehicles become, and we're expecting price parity to occur in about 2028. And what I mean by price parity is that a similar sized EV will cost around the same as that sort of vehicle, but in a petrol or diesel model. Then the payback will be much better for the EV because the running costs are so much cheaper, as I talked about earlier. So some of the key trends that I think is important to be aware of is we're seeing the cost of batteries come down quite a bit. But we're also getting batteries that are lasting longer than companies anticipated for. So there were some concerns in the early days that you'd have to replace your battery every 2 or 3 years. That's not the case now. And we've started to see cars that have been on the road for 8 or 9 years, they're still getting 80 or 90% of the battery life of what they got when they were brand new. So that's good news. And we're also seeing greater energy densities. That means you can fit in more energy into a battery for its size, which means that there's more room in the vehicle for people and storage rather than just storing the battery. We're also seeing faster charging and a lot more electric vehicle models that can accept a faster rate of charge, which means that if you are taking a road trip, you don't have to wait as long. But it is important to recognise that when people are charging an EV, you don't have to be at your car. You can lock your car, it's still charging, the cable is locked to your vehicle so no one can unplug it, and you can go for a walk around a park or grab something to eat while you're on a road trip. We'll also start to see more market differentiation. So we'll see some longer range vehicles where vehicles can travel even above 600 kilometres in a charge. And we'll also start to see, as I mentioned just before, some shorter range vehicles that are designed to act as a household second car for shorter distances that will be much cheaper because the battery doesn't need to be as big. We'll also see much cheaper domestic chargers. So at the moment, it costs about $1,000 for a charger that you have at home, and then probably another $1,000 to install it, depending upon your situation. We'll start to move very soon over the course of the next year or two into a situation where it's the sort of thing that you can just go down to Bunnings and buy, and then have an electrician install it at your home, and the charger might only cost $200 or $300. And then we'll also see the introduction, and this is already happening, of smarter chargers that are solar interactive. So the charger is smart enough to understand on a sunny day, if you've got solar power, instead of exporting that solar to the grid for next to nothing, you can divert that solar into your car's battery. So it acts as a solar sponge, and then you can use that electricity for your travels later on, rather than having to buy electricity through your retailer for a much higher rate. And as I'll talk about right now, we'll also see the introduction of motor vehicles, EVs, that can have bidirectional charging. And what I mean by that is that instead of the electricity going one way, so from the charger into your battery, you can also have the benefit of being able to draw electricity from your battery into your home, or to the grid, or to an appliance like a heater or a TV or a car fridge. So that's important because it opens up the possibility, and I know this happens in the outer ranges every now and then, especially in unusual weather events where you might lose a connection to the electricity grid. And I know that a couple of years ago, that huge storm in the outer ranges that knocked out electricity to a large number of homes, and some households were without electricity for a week or 2 weeks or more. If those households were to have bidirectional charging in their motor vehicle, you could actually use your electricity stored in your vehicle's battery to power your home. So that's something that's coming, and from about 2025, 2026, that will become an option for people that are interested in it. It also means that you can store electricity generated from your solar panels very cheaply, and then potentially in the future sell it to the grid for a higher rate on those high demand times if there are arrangements with the retailer to buy that electricity from you. So that's something that's already happening in some parts of Europe, and I expect that will be happening in Australia, and it's really only a matter of time once the standards become confirmed. I also mentioned before that EVs can be a real benefit to people that need to have remote access to power. This is an example of a Ford F-150 Lightning, which is a full battery electric ute that can offer, I think, 10 or 12 power outlets in the one vehicle, and you can do that bi-directional charging, where you've got what's called vehicle to load, where the power is coming from the vehicle to some sort of external load, in this case power tools for an off-site building. In terms of charging infrastructure, there are a number of different levels of charging infrastructure. So it's important to remember you can charge an electric car just from a normal power point at home. So you don't need anything special. And if you've got an EV and you're driving it to let's say to a friend's house or to a family member's house, and you need to charge up there, you don't need a special charger. You can just plug it straight into the wall. So that's important to recognize. It will charge up very slowly, but if you're there for a while, then it doesn't really matter. Then you've got higher levels of power, really. So 7 kilowatt chargers, which uses about the same amount of electricity as maybe 2 air conditioners running at the same time. And then right down the bottom of this table, we've got some super fast and ultra fast charging, which is the sort of thing that you'd expect to see perhaps in petrol stations or on the side of a motorway for people that are making an onward journey and they don't really want to be spending a lot of time there. So it's the sort of thing where after, say, 15 or 20 minutes, you'd have a decent level of charge in your battery in order to get to your final destination. In terms of costs for charging, it's either free. Some councils offer it for free, but mostly you'll be paying somewhere between 30 and 60 cents per kilowatt hour, depending upon the speed of charge. So the faster the charger, the more costly it is for the provider to install, and therefore the more you pay in terms of electricity. But it's still a lot, even paying the most for a charging session at a super fast charger is still much cheaper than charging your car with petrol or diesel, filling up your car, I should say, with petrol or diesel. In terms of plug types and payment methods, I think a lot of people a few years ago were quite worried about all the different plugs. Well, the good news is the plug wars are over, and basically for slow charging, a type 2 plug, which is what you can see on the left-hand side here, is the dominant form of charger, and every EV on the market now offers type 2 charging, so you don't need to worry about having a boot full of adapters because you're never quite sure what charging infrastructure will provide. And so most EV owners will have a type 2 cable in the boot of their car, and they'll just bring it out when they need to. For fast charging, CCS2 is the dominant form of fast charging cable. But for some Japanese cars in particular, like a Nissan Leaf, they use the CHAdeMO DC charging. I don't want to get too much into the technical aspects of it, but basically it's a different plug to provide DC charging. DC charging is fast charging, essentially. AC charging is slow charging. And most public chargers in Australia will offer, that are fast chargers, will offer both CCS charging and also CHAdeMO charging. So it's highly unlikely that you'll ever get stuck if you're at a charging station because you don't have the right plug. That's very rare indeed. And then for those that have an older EV, or if you pick up an EV secondhand that has a type 1 plug for AC charging, for slow charging, you can buy an adapter for, I don't know, around $300 or so to enable you to access all of the type 2 chargers. In terms of payment methods, it's really simple. So you don't have to put coins in the machine or try and get notes in there. It's all done electronically. So either the app, so there's a number of different charge point operators, as we call them, that run in Australia, and you sign up to their app, you put on your credit card details, and then you simply tap your phone to the charger, and it will just bill you for the electricity that you've used. Or you can just use your credit card on some chargers and just tap and go, so you don't need a mobile phone at all. So it's really simple, and you just get emailed a receipt or via text message, and away you go. So that is one of the simplest parts of owning an EV. And it's great to be able to travel around the country without having to go into a petrol station if you don't need to. I mentioned before that making a road trip can be somewhat complex because of the mileage reduction issue that you get when you're driving on the open road, but also if you're towing. And so there are a couple of really useful apps that people can use in order to find charging stations. One's called PlugShare. So basically almost every publicly available charging point is on PlugShare. It's just an app that you can open up either on your phone or on a website, and you can filter the results based upon the speed of charge that you're looking for, and it will show you where the charging plugs are. And you can also read reviews of people that have used those chargers to make sure that it's working, because they're not always working. Occasionally you'll get a charger that's there, but it's out of service. So using the PlugShare app in advance of your trip will help you have more confidence about whether your car will be able to charge at that location. And then there's another app called a Better Route Planner, which is quite a bit more complex. The user interface isn't nearly as friendly as PlugShare, but it does do some different things. Like you can, it takes into account weather, so things like headwinds, topography, the air temperature, because in very cold conditions, the battery range is less. You'll also put in how many kilos of luggage you're carrying, because that impacts on range as well. And it will tell you how many minutes you need to spend at each charger if you're taking a trip, say, from Lilydale to Cairns, which is something you can do on an EV. It will tell you where the charging spots that you need to spend time at and what percentage of battery life you'll have when you get to each charging location, and how long you'll have to spend at each charging location before you leave. So very detailed. User interface could use some improvement, I think, but it is useful. These are all the publicly available charging locations in Australia currently. So as you can see, fairly extensive, actually, more extensive than what most people think. But this includes slow charging as well. So the sort of charging that you might get at a caravan park, where you just basically plug into a normal power socket. But if you just look at the fast charging, it looks like this. So less extensive. So parts of remote Western Australia, Northern Territory, South Australia, and Western Queensland aren't particularly well served, but that's all about to change through a policy and a funding package that have been set up by the federal government. So in the next couple of years, there'll be many more dots on this map for fast chargers to help people make road trips into regional Australia. But the most important thing, I think, is that over 90% of charging actually happens at home. That's the easiest place to charge because you've got power there. You don't need to pay anything other than the residential rate of electricity, or if you've got solar power, really you're paying next to nothing. And all you do, even though it's a slow charge, it doesn't matter because you're doing things in your home anyway. So you're charging while you're there overnight, and you can have a full battery the next morning. So that's the most convenient place to charge. And yes, people say, oh, well, it will take 9 hours to charge, that's too long. It actually only takes 30 seconds to charge, 15 seconds to put the plug into your car, and then 15 seconds to take it out again. And that's really how most people that own EVs think about charging. And range anxiety is something that really goes away very quickly once you own an EV, because you start to understand just how many places there are to charge, and that you really only on average need to charge about once a week or once every 2 weeks anyhow. So it becomes a lot easier once you've actually got an EV to understand what's required. So solutions for households without EV charging options, and there may be some people in Yarra Ranges that might not have an easy place to charge an EV. So in London, they've been using their light poles to put in chargers. In the Netherlands, they do that at light poles and other curbside charging solutions, but they also have these charge arms that can come out over from your property over the footpath to charge an EV. And in Oslo, they put chargers onto the curbside. Actually, what they're doing in Oslo is probably the most common form of charging an EV for those that don't have access to an off-street car park. That happens right around the world, and it's beginning to happen in Australia as well, mostly starting in Sydney. And this is part of the trial of what's happening in Sydney, where they're actually mounting chargers onto a light pole. So that's really all I wanted to talk about today, and I wanted to make sure there's enough time for questions. So I'm happy to stop sharing my screen now, and we can try and either go to the next speaker or to answer any questions that came through now, depending upon what you'd like to do, Sarah.
I think we'll hand over to Leanne, and then we'll finish up with questions for the remainder of the time. So over to Leanne.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, I'll just share my screen, make sure it's working. You can see that?
Yep.
Great. Thanks, Sarah, for the introduction, and thanks, Elliot, for that very informative presentation. And thanks, everyone, for your interest in this topic and for taking some time out tonight to learn more about it. We thought that tonight's webinar is a good opportunity to update you on what Yarra Ranges Council is doing to transition its fleet to zero emissions and to support the community as it transitions to zero emissions vehicles. Yarra Ranges Council's 2020 to 2030 Livable Climate Plan includes a target of zero emissions from fleet, plant and equipment by 2030, and achievement of this will help progress towards the goal of net zero emissions by 2040. Fuel use for council's fleet, plant and equipment is responsible for about 15% of council's greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a really good opportunity there to cut a good proportion of council's emissions by reducing those fleet emissions and plant emissions. So council's fleet's made up of cars, utes, vans, small trucks such as tipper trucks, and heavy trucks such as tray trucks, and larger tipper trucks and plants such as tractors, diggers, ride-on mowers and leaf blowers and saws. If you're a Yarra Ranges resident, you've probably seen some of these around supporting the delivery of council services. And as Elliot touched on, in addition to the benefit of reduced greenhouse gas emissions, the transition to zero emission fleet and plant for Yarra Ranges will benefit in terms of less reliance on fossil fuels, improved health and safety with less noise, less air pollution and fumes, as well as the benefit to the ongoing budget with reduced cost for maintenance and fuel. So I just thought I'd outline some info on our community charging infrastructure at the moment. The number of electric vehicles chargers in Yarra Ranges is growing. Some businesses have installed electric vehicle charging, and there are now a few installed at public car parks across the municipality. If you look on the PlugShare app that Elliot mentioned, you'll be able to see the number of chargers in the Yarra Ranges. The first public charger was installed at Yarra Glen in 2022 by Yarra Glenergy, who worked with the council and the state government to install a public fast charger near the community hall in Yarra Glen. So it's really well located for people who need to have a quick top up, and they can go and visit the local shops while they're charging. Following that, EV Networks has been working with council and the Victorian government to install a 50 kilowatt fast charger at council car parking spaces in Belgrave, Healesville and Yarra Junction, and these will be available soon, and I've included some under construction images of those fast chargers. So Healesville and Belgrave are there on the slide. They will be operational very soon, and Yarra Junction will be constructed later on this year. We also hope that Lilydale and Monbulk will follow, with provision made for community electric vehicle charging at the Civic Centre in Lilydale and the Monbulk Living and Learning Centre. And these chargers are user pays and powered by renewable energy. So for council's transition, it's already started. We have 2 electric vehicles, Hyundai Ioniqs, 7 hybrid cars, smaller Corollas. We have 8 hybrid trucks, they're Hino small trucks, and 2 electric forklifts, and over 50 items of small plant, including leaf blowers, chainsaws, and hedge trimmers. And this slide just outlines the different components that we're considering in our electric vehicle transition. So firstly, we're ensuring that we meet the charging needs of council's future fleet, and that buildings' power supplies have the capacity to support the additional electrical load for vehicles and plant and equipment charging. And so this might mean working with local energy distributors where we need upgrades to our power supplies. The second component is installation of charging infrastructure. We currently have a grant from the Victorian Government to install chargers for council's fleet at 3 council sites. That includes Lilydale, Yarra Junction, and Monbulk. And this will support more electric vehicles being added to council's fleet. The next component is the human component, and a lot of teams across council will use the zero emissions fleet and plant and the related charging infrastructure. So it's important that we all work together to ensure that we understand what we need from our zero emissions replacements, and that we purchase things up to the task, and that drivers and operators are trained to confidently and safely use the electric vehicles and the new technology. As Elliot mentioned, there are a number of small electric cars and SUVs on the Australian market now, but there are less options for utes and four-wheel drives and trucks. So we need to keep our eyes on these and be ready to purchase when the time's right. And the next two components about purchasing plant and equipment and vehicles is about that, and being ready when our vehicles are due for replacement, to update them with zero emissions options if they are there. And the final component is, where possible, working with local trades and industry to install charging infrastructure, and the procurement, maintenance and repair of vehicles and plants. And this will help grow the local emissions economy, and it will also hopefully help to stimulate the second-hand vehicle market in the Yarra Ranges. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, and we can move on. I'll hand back to Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Leanne. And I can see that Elliot has been answering some of the questions already. Thank you for that, Elliot. We've got a couple of questions in there. We've got one about saying that council is hesitant around EV charging, which I think what Leanne's just spoken to about the charging that's being installed in the next couple of months indicates that we're, supporting that transition. I'd also sort of like to maybe elaborate on that point in relation to the industry context around EV charging infrastructure, and that eventually the EV charging infrastructure will be delivered by like the equivalent of petrol stations, where there will be centralised charging. And in that respect, it's not necessarily the role of council to provide that infrastructure in the long-term picture of EV charging. And we are, supporting that transition phase between no charging infrastructure to that future. Elliot, was there anything that you could add? I can see there's been a question around the embodied energy of EVs. Did you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. That actually comes up a lot, and sorry for not identifying that as a component of my presentation. So it is true that there's more emissions associated with the production of an EV than there is for a similar sized vehicle that's petrol or diesel. So it's about 17 or 18% more embodied energy because of the rare earths and the refining of them to build into the battery. But because once they're on the road, if they're powered by renewable energy, and a lot of them are, because a lot of people that buy EVs also have solar, and also, as I mentioned before, the public charging network is largely powered by renewable energy. It means that the car only has to be used for somewhere between 6 months and 2 years before you've made up the difference in the emissions of the production of the vehicle. And that means that every bit of drive that you do after that time period is benefit that that is in EV's favour or in the favour of lower emissions. So it depends a little bit on how much you use the vehicle, but for ranges conditions where vehicles drive more than they do, say, in inner city Melbourne, that payback period would be quicker. So, and I mean the emissions payback period. So yes, there are more emissions associated with the EV production, but that would not be a reason not to get one and to continue to drive a petrol or diesel powered vehicle, because an EV will be on the road for anywhere between 15 and 25 years, potentially longer, because of the lack of moving parts. And therefore, from an emissions perspective, you're much better off in an EV than you are in buying an internal combustion engine vehicle. It's also important to recognise that some vehicle manufacturers that manufacture EVs are moving towards a zero emission production cycle in their factories as well. So Audi, I think, are the first ones to do that, but I imagine there's going to be a lot more moving on. So yeah, it's an issue to be cognizant of, but I don't think it should prevent somebody that would otherwise buy an EV from buying one.
Thanks for that, Elliot. And does that mean that for example, a second-hand EV, that they've already sort of skipped over that part of the embodied energy and their or the embodied emissions, and they're already clear?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, you can't double count that. So if the first owner was counting it, then the second owner shouldn't. Yeah,
perfect. All right, so we've got a few questions around, I suppose, if you've got a totally electric vehicle, if the battery is flat, then a fossil engine drive generator will charge the EV battery. I think maybe speaking to how EV charging works, maybe in that respect.
Yeah, so there have been instances where people or organisations like RACV, RAQ, or the associated bodies in other parts of Australia have actually purchased a generator to be able to power an EV that needs an emergency charge. There are also charging stations on the Nullarbor that use diesel from biodiesel from fryers in roadhouses to power the charger. So there's a variety of different ways of powering an EV. There's even large Tesla supercharging stations that at very high demand times actually require diesel generators to support that. And I sympathise with people's concerns around that. It's certainly not the way that you'd want to do it ideally, but I think it's one of those things where when you've got teething issues, where you've got an underdeveloped EV charging network or you've got an underdeveloped electricity grid, you'll get those odd sorts of occurrences. And whilst it might seem like a conflict or a contradiction, ultimately, if you're driving a car 30,000 kilometres a year and for 70 kilometres you drove the car using electrons that were produced from a diesel generator, then you're still coming out a lot better. And I'm sure that 99.9% of all people that own EVs have never had to get a diesel generator to power their EV up. So what I think we're more likely to see in the future, because there will be instances where people have underestimated how much electricity they were using and they've been caught with 0% electricity in their battery. What we'll start to see more likely is a electric vehicle that has an auxiliary battery designed to give a top-up charge, and that electricity will be powered by renewable energy. So that's already happening in some parts of the world that have a more mature EV market than ours. But yeah, that they're just kind of odd occurrences that I would put down to the teething issues associated with a very new, immature market with a lot of early adopters that are experiencing the issues associated with a a charging network that is underdeveloped.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Elliot. I actually have a couple for Leanne. So we've got one around managing the charging of council EVs going forward, given they are used mainly during the day. How will the charging be met in the evening?
So what we're looking at the moment for key sites around the municipality is that we'll be looking at whether we can have a charging regime that maximises access to solar energy. So solar panels on the roof of our buildings will be producing solar during the day as people take the vehicle out in the morning, do what they need to do, come back in for lunch, or after they finish their meetings, come back in, put the vehicle on the charger when the solar is producing, and then the next person that's booked the car out will be able to take it out. It's been recharged a bit with the solar energy. The other thing is charging overnight. We are hoping that we can use things like batteries to soak up our excess solar energy, and that will then be used on a programmed basis to charge the vehicles when they're parked at council sites overnight. Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Sarah?
No, I think that covers it. And there's a question that's in around about council starting to require or prefer contractors to move to EVs, and I think that will be encouraged as the market changes, and probably included in contracts where appropriate.
Yeah, that's correct.
All right, I'm just looking at the time. We have 1 minute left. I've just got a good question in there around the average annual cost of owning an EV compared to a conventional car and the lifespan. Elliot, did you want to jump on that quickly?
Yeah, look, it's around $2,000. It obviously depends upon how much driving you do. It's around $2,000 and for the ownership costs, and it's around $5,000 for a petrol or diesel vehicle. But again, it depends a lot upon what sort of EV you buy, what sort of petrol or diesel vehicle you buy, and also how much driving you do.
Beautiful. All right. There's a last question in there, which I don't know if we have time to answer, which is around the cost of maintenance of public charges, which, Elliot, do you have any figures around the maintenance cost for these types of charges?
I don't have those figures at hand, but basically it depends a bit about what sort of charger you're looking at. So if it's a DC charger, that requires a lot more maintenance than an AC charger. The slow charger, that's what I mean when I'm talking about AC. It also depends about whether the charger has a tethered cable, so the cable stays with the charger, or whether it's a situation of a bring your own cable. If it's bring your own cable, then the charger lasts a lot longer because the cable is owned by the individuals that use it, and you just plug in your cable. Because it's cable maintenance and wear and tear that's the most common issues from a maintenance perspective. But it really depends upon how heavily it's used. So for instance, in Marybeck Council, formerly Moreland, there's a lot of wear and tear on those chargers because they offer free DC charging. And so a lot of people come from other parts of Melbourne and charge up there, so they're much busier. Whereas if you're charging, if you've got a rate of say 60 cents per kilowatt hour, then you'll have less usage compared to free charging. But it varies a lot, but it could be anywhere between say $200 a year to $1,000 a year for maintenance. But occasionally there'll be large out-of-pocket expenses that the charge point operator will typically need to bear, because as you say, Sarah, we're increasingly entering a phase in which it's commercial charge point operators that own and manage these chargers rather than councils. That's increasingly where things are headed.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Elliot. And there's just one last one, sorry to keep you on, but around fire safety issues and what that means for EVs.
Yeah, so the chances of a fire occurring with an EV are about 11 times less than a petrol or diesel powered vehicle, but the intensity of those fires can be much greater. So it's harder to put out, but it's much less likely to start. It's actually part of an ongoing piece of research that ARB, which is the Australian Road Research Board, is currently doing. They haven't finished yet, but they're looking into that. It's not really so much of a problem for individuals, but for building managers that might have in the future 10 or 15 EVs all parked close to each other, and the possibility of one catching fire from the other one is something that is being looked at. And in places like Norway, their fire department has special equipment designed to put out an EV fire, because the way that a fire department addresses an EV fire is very different to how they would address a petrol or diesel related fire. So much less likely to happen, but if it does happen, it is complex to put out. That's all I can really say on that at this stage, but ARB have a special research body that is looking into that in more detail as we get more EVs on the road.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you so much for that. And I just answered a few more questions that we had sitting there. So thank you for all of your time tonight, Elliot and Leanne, and taking us through, I suppose I want to say the A to Z of EVs, but effectively how we go about getting them, how we charge them, how it is to have one, and what it means more broadly for I suppose our emissions and our transport sector. So thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining us. If you have any questions, you can email them through to sustainability, and you should be taken to a survey once you finish up. It would be great to have your feedback on the session. Overall, thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you have a lovely evening.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Good
Bye.
evening all.
Bye.